Okie doke. Part two, part two of chapter 9, managing groups and teams. In part two, we're going to talk about two different ideas. One, some team design characteristics, and then actually, what does an effective team look like? We'll start by talking about some team tasks. Again, I want you to be thinking about within an organization, there could be production tasks. Think produce. This is where we actually make something. A team might have idea generation tasks. This is where we're having to come up with something creative, maybe a new marketing strategy, maybe a new social media plan, maybe a new way of structuring the organization, anything that requires us to be creative. And then problem solving, pretty straightforward, right? We've identified a problem, we've come up with some solutions. Well, now we've got to get talking about, well, how are we going to put those solutions into play? How are we going to implement those solutions? And we're going to have to make decisions about budgets, about personnel, about timing, etc. Those are all problem-solving tasks. Teams engage in all of these tasks. When we talk about tasks, we want to talk also about interdependence. Now, this is a very dense slide. I want you to make sure that you very carefully read what the text says, the textbook says about this topic of task interdependence. This is defined as the degree that team members are dependent on one another to get information, support, or materials. So, how is it that I depend on other people? Different kinds of teams can depend upon each other in different ways. Let me try and give some examples to illustrate each of these. Pooled interdependence, as it says, exists when team members can go ahead and work independently, and then at the end, they just put everything together, okay? So they just combine their efforts to create whatever the team's output might be. This could be a report, for example, that has, let's say, 5 parts, and the 5 parts are very discrete, meaning one doesn't necessarily have to flow into the other. They're almost like separate papers by themselves, if you can imagine. And perhaps the expertise that's associated with creating each of those separate 5 pieces is quite distinct, quite different. In other words, the expertise doesn't overlap between or among the members of the team. So we've got the structural engineers perhaps working on one piece, the geotechnical folks working on another piece, the IT folks working on another piece, and so on. And then at the end, at some deadline point, everything comes together and the final report is done. That would be an example of pooled interdependence. Again, discrete, definite, separate, everybody does their own thing, and then at the end they put it together. Sequential interdependence occurs if one person's output becomes another person's input. Think of, for example, assembly line processes. These are sequentially interdependent. I do my thing, then I hand it off to you. You take that thing that I've given to you, and you do some things to it, and then you pass it on to the next person, who does some things to it and passes it on to the next person. Again, my output becomes your input. Your output becomes another person's input, and so on and so forth. Sequential interdependence. Now, you can see that in terms of what the final product looks like with sequential interdependence, it's sort of like the game of telephone that maybe you played when you were younger. That final outcome is going to depend a lot on not only how well each person has done their thing, but what did they have to work with from the person before them or the group before them. All right, so sequential interdependence, again, inputs, outputs, etc., one after the other, until we get to the end. Reciprocal interdependence occurs when people are working together on every step of the project. They're all together all the time working on this. So it's not pooled, where everyone just goes off and does their thing, and then we just sort of all throw it into a big pot at the end. or sequential where I work on my thing, then I give it to you, you work on the thing, then you hand it to somebody else. But reciprocal is basically we're all in the room, we're all in the same space. We don't have to be in the same space. We could be working virtually, right, with our computers and so on, but we're all working at the same time. Think about, for example, a Google Doc that everyone is contributing to at the same time. We are reciprocally interdependent at that point. Outcome interdependence exists when the rewards that an individual receives depend on the performance of others. Ideally, what we want to do when it comes to outcomes or rewards is we want people to know that we see them for what they have individually done, and we also see them for their contribution to the whole. And when you have a high degree of outcome interdependence, basically what that means is everyone knows that in order for them to get a good reward, the best reward, it means everyone's got to work well together. Okay, they are highly interdependent at that point. Now, sometimes you will get to work in a situation where the team's tasks, the interdependence, it's pooled. So you're an expert in your area, you go off and do your thing, and then somebody just compiles it all at the end. Sometimes it'll be sequential, where you do your thing, you hand it off to another person, they do some more tweaking, they add their parts, then they hand that, which is now yours plus theirs, off to another person who adds more, and then hands that off to another person. So yours plus theirs, off to another person. And reciprocal, where you're working in real time together, solving problems together, not one after the other like sequential, and not all separately and then pull it together, but all together the whole time. None of these is necessarily better than the others. The kind of interdependence you'll observe will depend on, well, what's the task? And does it require more or less interdependence? Does it require reciprocal versus sequential or pooled? What you don't want to do is assume, for example, that ideally what should be happening is pooled interdependence. We'll all go off and do our own thing, and then somebody will pull it together at the end when, let's say, what should have been happening was reciprocal interdependence. I see this a lot with student projects where they're working on a major paper, presentation, and people will think, well, I'll go off and do mine, I'll go off and do mine, and somebody will just pull it together. And what you end up with is a paper that has 4 or 5 different voices, repetition, some things that are or not explained well, all because the team hasn't handled things as they should, which would have been either sequentially, where before person 2 starts working, person 1 has finished theirs, right? And then person 2 takes that and adds to it and then hands it off to person 3, or reciprocal, where people worked in real time. One of the neat things about the tools we have these days, the technology that we have these days, is that it is in fact much easier for us to work reciprocally, which theoretically for many projects should yield a better outcome because, again, assuming that it wasn't a case where each piece could be discretely set up as I first described with pooled, but rather we know we want to build on each other. We know that we want our final outcome to reflect everything we've done. Well, in that case, reciprocal interdependence makes a lot of sense. And good news, we've got tools to make that happen, like things like Google Docs. Within teams, there are a number of roles that need to be played. I want to emphasize something here as you look at this graphic. This isn't telling you that we need to have, let's count it out here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in a team. That's not what it's saying. It's saying there are 10 roles. All these roles should be played, but any one person could, in fact, play more than one role. It is not the case that a person can only play one. A person could, in fact, play multiple roles, but all of these things need to get done. Those in green, these are task roles. These right over here, contractor, creator, contributor, completer, critic. The social roles, these are the ones in this kind of icky yellow, cooperator, communicator, calibrator, and then finally the boundary spanning roles. These are in the orange, the person doing the consulting and the coordinator. And again, brief descriptions in the text articulating what these are all about. Key point, all of these have to get done. What kinds of teams are there? Well, they're all different kinds. Again, these are the backbone, basically, of organizations today. You're going to be a member of more than one team going forward in your career. So the more you can do now as a student to get good at this, the better. A task force, here we're talking about a temporary team. They've got a specific issue or problem. They work on that problem, and then the team is dissolved. They no longer work together. A product development team could be temporary, could be ongoing. Again, the name tells you what they're doing. They're responsible for developing a product, possibly a product line. A cross-functional team appears in what are called matrix organizations. Don't get too hung up on that phrasing right now. Basically, all that means is that people are part of a functional department. So they're in accounting, or they're in IT, they're in marketing, they're in production. And then they're asked to also serve on, let's say, a project team or a process team. So that cross-functional team, that project or process team, might have someone from accounting, someone from marketing, someone from IT, someone from production, and together they'll work on some process or project that needs the attention, the expertise of all those different functions. A virtual team, pretty straightforward. When people are working together, but they're not located in the same physical place. Boy, we are getting good at this stuff, aren't we, with this quarantine? Virtual teams could include people from all around the globe. I myself have been a member of more than one virtual team where the folks that I worked with were nowhere near me. For example, this summer, going into next fall, I'm going to be working with a group of people, some of whom are located in New York City, some of them who are located in other parts of the globe. I just finished working on a major project, I should say, for the federal government, in which people were located in Washington, D.C., little old me from De Pere, Wisconsin, in San Francisco, and elsewhere. And while we met a few times face to face, we actually did most of our work virtually. So we did a lot of these kinds of things, a lot of Google Hangout, other GoToMeeting, WebEx. I mean, they're all different platforms, Microsoft Teams that a person might use in order to help that virtual team get its job done. And finally, you'll hear about top management teams. These are the folks who report directly to the CEO or the chief executive officer of an organization. And the membership of this team typically reflects the skills and areas that the CEO thinks are vital for that organization. So we might have a chief financial officer. That'd be pretty common, actually. A chief operating officer, a chief information officer, a chief technology officer. They often have chief in front of their name and in front of the rest of their title, their label. Okay, so they become part of the C-suite, all these people with the first word in their title starting with a C, okay? Or they could be an executive VP or just a senior VP, whatever. The nomenclature doesn't really matter. What matters is these are the folks who report to the CEO, who are part of that person's core team. We can talk about team leadership and autonomy. There are the traditional manager-led teams that most of you are familiar with. The manager, let's say, of the department or whatever is the team leader. That person assigns work to everybody else. That person also often, not always necessarily, but often has the power, the authority to hire and fire team members, to decide who's going to be on their team. They're also on the other end of the spectrum, what we call self-managed teams, where they don't have a manager. They don't need a manager. They manage themselves. So the members of the team choose who's going to lead. This could be ongoing. It could be month to month. It could be meeting to meeting, taking turns. Who's going to be the leader? They share responsibility for some significant task. And they have not only the responsibility, but also the authority. So they can do what they need to do in order to get the job done. Okay. That takes care of the first major topic for this part 2. The second major topic actually builds on the material that's been presented already. So it should be pretty straightforward, pretty understandable. And we're talking about designing effective teams. So not just having a team, but Let's have a really great team. Remember what effectiveness is. Effectiveness is achieving goals. First thing we have to look at, we have a few categories. Composition is the first big category. And within that, we're going to talk about size and diversity. Both of these are really important. The appropriate composition for any task is going to depend on the type of task. Somehow we've got to figure out who's going to be the best for the team. We want to make sure that people are qualified. In order to know that, we've got to know what people's knowledge, skills, and abilities are. What are they good at? Also, what's their personality like? Are they the kind of person who's open, who's agreeable, who's conscientious? This should all sound familiar, right? Or are they more neurotic? Are they a person with an external locus of control? We have to be able to communicate the job requirements, the norms of the team, and we want to think about diversity. Diversity of all kinds in terms of personality, gender, age, education, functional specialization, that's that, accounting, marketing, IT, etc., a person's functions, and their experience. Why do we want diversity? Because when people come at a topic, a project, a problem from different perspectives, the group working together is more likely to actually solve that problem. Diversity is a great thing. It can be challenging to manage, but the positives associated with the effective management of diversity are well worth having to deal with whatever challenges one needs to deal with. A reasonable question is always, how large should the team be? Well, I'm going to tell you the answer. You know, the book will say things like group size should be between 2 and 20 members. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. The second bullet is true, that groups with more than 20 members might have less cooperation. It might be more difficult to help them be a cohesive group. But the truth is simple. The right size for any team, for any group, is a function of what the group or team is trying to accomplish. As it says in big, bold letters on the bottom of this slide, team size should be matched to the goals of the team. This is what decides how big the team should be, period. Period. What is it that the team has to do? You want exactly that number of people, whatever the number is, that number of people needed to make sure that that task, that set of goals can be accomplished. Not one more, not one less. You don't want one more because you're going to have slacking, social loafing. You don't want one less because you'll create unnecessary stress and make it more difficult for the team to actually be effective. So what decides how big the team should be? What the team has to do. It's that simple. The larger you get, especially if you go beyond what you actually need in order to do the job, the harder it is to coordinate, the harder it is for people to interact as a team. What'll end up happening is people will break off into subgroups and they won't be thinking about the overall team as much. When you have fewer people, I would argue the right number of people, team members are more able to work through differences and to agree on a common plan of action, even when they are very diverse. Other things to be thinking about in the overall area or category of team composition. Members' abilities. They need to have technical skills. This is the how to do whatever it is they're being asked to do. For example, in a group project in a class, people might need to have financial skills. Those of you who are accounting or business majors, you'll take the strategy seminar as your capstone seminar. You're going to need to know corporation finance. You're going to need to know some accounting. You're going to need to know some marketing. You're going to need to know some management. You're going to need to know some IT. Those are all technical skills, okay? And ideally, what you want in your team, you want to make sure that whatever technical skills are needed to do the job, hey, at least somebody's got those skills. You'll need the problem solving and decision making skills. So people who are able to identify, okay, we have a gap between what we want and what we have, and how can we sketch a path to solve that problem, to get rid of that gap. People who know how to make good decisions, people who know how to manage conflict, okay? And then, of course, interpersonal skills, because as we know, going back to our chapter on leadership, it isn't just about getting the job done. That's the task-oriented set of behaviors, right? The other major set of behaviors that people have to exemplify, manifest, are relations-oriented behaviors. So we need interpersonal skills. This relates to personality. You'll notice what's listed here. These are the big five. You know, we want people who are open, people who are conscientious. We need people who will get things done. We need a mix of extrovert and introvert. Extroverts bring all kinds of energy and they get conversations going. Introverts are better typically at reflecting and identifying key ideas. We need people who are agreeable, but not so agreeable that they avoid conflict. And then finally, a little bit of neuroticism goes a long way. Not a lot of neuroticism. We don't want people so anxious that they can't move forward, but a little bit of neuroticism gets people focused on deadlines, and that matters. In terms of personality, if you've got one bad apple, that can spoil the barrel, right? One person can make it so that nobody wants to work in the group. Finally, on this slide, member flexibility. People have to value it, and it's helpful if we can do some cross-training so that more than one person can do each task that the group needs done to accomplish its overall task. We also need to talk about roles. We talked about this before. Again, I want to emphasize all of them need to be filled. So as we're putting together our team, as we're deciding on that team composition, we want to make sure that we have the right people in the right roles, okay? And again, people can play multiple roles. These are three that I think are especially important. The coordinator, the person who sort of pulls it all together, at least one person in that creator role. And again, notice more than one person could play this role. It isn't the case that only one person can play each role. Multiple people can play each role working together. Someone who initiates creative ideas, so important. And then finally, a communicator, someone who can champion ideas after they're initiated, someone who can explain those ideas to other people, someone who can listen well and hear what people are saying. Okay, so this is all the team composition stuff. Basically, putting your team together, making sure you got the right people who know what they need to do, who have the skills, who have the personality to do what needs to be done. And then we can talk about context. So this team is operating in a context. It's in an organization. And what do they need? Three things, probably more, but these three things in particular. They've got to have resources. Remember when we talked in chapter 5 about motivation, we said that performance is a function of motivation times ability times, there was that environment piece, which included resources. In order for teams to be highly effective, they've got to have the resources they need. Information, the equipment, the staffing, the encouragement, the admin assistance, all of that. Everything that helps them to do what needs to be done. There also needs to be a climate of trust. They have to believe in each other. Very specifically, trustworthiness is a function of two things: our competence and our character. Let me illustrate this. Let's say you have a car and your car breaks down and you would like to get the car fixed. You've never had to take the car to anybody before, so you ask around and you're asking people, well, where do you take your car when you've got an issue and you want it to get fixed and you don't want to get screwed, basically. And so you collect some data from other people. Basically, what you're collecting from people is whether they have a trustworthy mechanic, someone they know who, A, knows what they're doing, right? Actually knows how cars work and how to fix them. And 2, has character, meaning they won't try to cheat people. They will follow through on their promises. When they say that something will cost X amount, that's what it ends up costing. They're fair in terms of how they estimate their labor needs, etc. This is someone we can trust. We see their competence, so they know what they're doing, and their character. Well, in order for a team to be really effective, they have to trust each other. And trust is something that we build over time as a result of experience with each other. This is how we know that someone will actually do what they say they're going to do. People always say they can be trusted, right? But can they? How do we know? Well, we observe them. We pay attention. When they tell us they're going to do something, we check to make sure that they actually do. And when they do, and when they do it well, now we know we can trust them. Finally, in team context, the reward systems. The reward systems, this goes back to everything we know about motivation, have to reward both the individual and they have to take into account the team. What is the person's contribution to the team, and overall, how well did the team do? Rewards have to take both of those things into account. If they don't, what we end up with, well, we end up with more social loafing. We end up with people not feeling ownership. And so it's a whole lot easier to not put forth our best effort. Okay, so that's all the team context. So we talked about composition, context, and then the final big category, team process. Again, all of this builds on topics that we have been discussing all along. There's really nothing new here. It's just a matter of putting it all together. So effective teams have common purpose, that big vision. Think about when we talked about, for example, charismatic leadership. And one of the main categories of behaviors that charismatic leaders display is envisioning, where they're able to articulate this really important, this big, juicy vision that people want to go after. Common purpose gives people direction, helps them choose how they're going to spend their time. Also gets momentum, gets things moving, and helps people to commit. So a common purpose. SMART goals, well, we talked about this in chapter 6, right? Specific, measurable, aggressive, yet realistic, and time bound. These are the things that facilitate communication, because when we set SMART goals as a team, as a group, we're essentially agreeing on what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it. That way, we can follow up with each other to know, are we on track? And remember how important feedback is to performance, right? We have to know how we're doing in order to do better. Team efficacy, this is collective efficacy. Again, that collective self-confidence. When we're working with people, when we feel confident that with these people we can do anything, oh my gosh, success just breeds success, right? This is why as a leader, one of the things you want to do is early on in the process, make it possible for people to have some victories, to have some success, and they want to keep working with each other. Again, this is basic reinforcement theory. When people are positively reinforced for doing something, they want to engage in that behavior again and again and again. Next, productive conflict. I've talked about this in this whole chapter. Two different kinds of conflict. There's cognitive or task, and then there's affective or relationship conflict. The first stuff is good. It's important. We want to have disagreements over what we're doing and how we're doing it, because that's how we refine. This is how we make things better, okay? We look at the status quo, the way things are done now, and we go, yuck, we could do things better. We want that kind of conflict. We want people to say, hey, I think it could be better. The affective or the relationship conflict, this is the stuff that's just icky, okay? Where I don't like the way a person talks, I don't like the way this person lives their life. Okay, there's no room for that kind of stuff in work teams. We have to learn to set that stuff aside to focus on what is it that we're doing and how are we doing it, and not get hung up on whether someone is just like us or is someone we want to hang out with after work, okay? You're going to work with people you don't want to hang out with after work. That's okay. You can still work well with these people. Finally, a lack of social loafing. We have to be able to hold each other accountable. To do this is going to require that we set those roles, that everyone is clear about what everyone is supposed to be doing, and that we understand the kind of interdependence we have, and that we're sure we've selected appropriately, whether it's pooled, sequential, or reciprocal. We have to be able to hold ourselves and each other accountable. And when we do that, well, when we do all of this stuff, we end up with amazing teams, the kind that make us think, oh man, I wouldn't mind being part of this team for a long, long time. And that brings us to the end of this topic.